approach in the same way. We're going to think about context first, because just like Romeo and Juliet, the context is important. The novel wasn't conceived in a vacuum. It's something that's been crafted and kind of forged, I suppose, in a specific historical context. So let's think about the who and the what and the where and the why. So firstly, our author, Arthur Conan Doyle. What do we know about him, his views, his inspiration? Well, principally, I think we know that he was a child of that era. So he is a late Victorian gentleman, isn't he? He lives a refined middle-class life. He's educated, and he is reflecting many of the views that were held by his contemporaries at the time. He's not an unusual man in terms of his views. He's quite conservative, certainly very socially conservative, and we'll see that as we look at it. And he's living in a time in which the empire and the perception of Great Britain as great has really shaped his view of himself and his country, and I think that's really important. We know that he was educated in Edinburgh, and that one of the doctors who he trained under, because he trained as a doctor, just like Dr. Watson, one of the doctors who he trained under was very similar to Sherlock Holmes in lots of ways. He was very clever, he was very perceptive, he noticed things that other people didn't, but that he was probably somebody who we might nowadays expect to be diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder, somebody who's quite myopically focused on certain things to the exclusion of other things, someone who finds it difficult to relate to other people. And I think we see that reflected in the characterization of Sherlock. So he's drawn inspiration from somebody he knew in his life, but ultimately and fundamentally somebody who he really admired. So that's important. Sherlock Holmes is supposed to be someone, certainly based on someone, who Conan Doyle really looked up to. So he's not perfect, and we see that, but he is supposed to be a figure that we look up to and appreciate the genius of, I suppose. The next thing I've put for the what is the genre, just like I did with the Romeo and Juliet. So I've called it genre defining, because really all detective novels and detective stories since this was written have in some way drawn on the tropes that Conan Doyle established. Now some of these was Doyle drawing on people who wrote before him, but the idea of having the detective who is a figure who is a loner, who has personal problems or addictions, demons if you like, someone who is brilliant but doesn't let people get close, like that's familiar from every detective TV programme you've ever watched, isn't it? They're always single men, they're always hard drinkers, they always have problems in their family, but they're always genius and looked up to by everybody on their team or whatever. The only thing is with this one, of course, he's not a police officer, is he? Usually the detectives that we read about now are police officers or retired police officers, but in this case Sherlock Holmes is just a private detective, and that elevates him, especially at this period, because the Victorian perception of the police was that they were nice to have strolling around as a warning, but they weren't very effective at solving crimes. And in fact, when the police were created in the late 19th century, the force was there purely to protect the property of the rich, basically. They were there to stroll up and down dark streets with their truncheons and their lamps, you know, putting people off from breaking into rich people's houses. That's all they were for. They were agents of the state there to protect capital, essentially. They weren't there to fix things or work out what had happened. And that really, a light was thrown on that, wasn't it, with the murders in Whitechapel, you know, the Jack the Ripper murders, which they were completely powerless to solve. And they did, by that time, have a team of detectives, and they founded Scotland Yard, where the detectives were based, but they weren't able to solve it. Now, they didn't have modern forensics, obviously, but one of the things Conan Doyle shows us is that a modern and scientific mind, even in the 1890s, does look at things forensically, which just means to look at things very, very closely. And that's what Sherlock does. So he highlights for us the ineffectiveness of the police, which echoes the views of people at that time anyway. I've said that for the where, the most significant thing is that it's late Victorian London. So it's not even just that it's Victorian London, but it's late Victorian. There's huge expansion of the city at this time. The city, if you go to London now, and the same is true actually when you walk around York, loads and loads and loads of the terrace houses that you see are built between about 1870 and 1910. That period was just a huge, huge boom in growth and house building and expansion of the city. So London as it was, the old city of London, was actually relatively small, and you'll know that if you've been on holiday there and walked around the galleries and museums in central London, it's all very close together. London now, of course, is absolutely huge, and that was the beginning of this, and there's references to that in the text, like the tentacles of the city reaching outwards. Whether or not Conan Doyle approves of this or not is sort of ambiguous. Certainly I think he sees it as a reflection of the greatness of Britain, that there's this ever-expanding, ever-moving outwards, and a sense of progress, because I do think, even though he's very socially conservative, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, I think that Conan Doyle relished the idea that Britain was a sort of leading light and that they could be at the forefront of making scientific discoveries, learning new things, innovating new techniques to make people's lives easier. I think he was in favour of that kind of progress. Obviously it's at the height of empire. I've written there Glorious Britannia, which is a kind of personification of Britain, as this glorious figure who ruled over the world, benevolently. We of course know now that that wasn't the case at all. The British Empire was anything but benevolent, but it did stretch right across the globe. They said the sun never sets on the British Empire, which was true, because somewhere it was always daytime because there was so much of the earth that was ruled by the British. Now that kind of power, even if it's not personally yours but it just belongs to your country, it corrupts, doesn't it? It makes people enjoy that kind of power. And I think Conan Doyle kind of flexes a bit over that, and we see that at various points in the novel. I've mentioned there the angel in the house. Now that's just a reference to a sort of trope that, and by that I mean like a sort of classification that we spot in literature. A trope is like a theme or a common feature that we find in literature. But the angel in the house trope is a label that critics now have given to characterizations of women in Victorian novels as like perfect angels, women who do what they're told, who are quiet, submissive, pious and religious, good mothers, obedient partners, and so on. They're not a particularly realistic portrayal, I don't think, necessarily, of the way all women were, but they're an idealised version of womanhood, and Conan Doyle absolutely ascribes to that, and Mary Morstan is the personification of the angel in the house. And we'll sort of come back to her in a little while. I've talked about the expanding city of London. I've said shifting social mores. What I mean by that is there's the rules are sort of changing around class, really. There's slightly more flexibility than there used to be, I think, by the time Conan Doyle's writing this. But it's still very much a Victorian world, and it's one in which people tend to stay in the class into which they're born. Certainly the only possible movement is from the working class into the middle class. One can't move from the middle class into the upper class. That just couldn't be done. You had to be born into it. But there are people who are kind of muddying the waters, and we can see Sherlock is one of those characters, actually. Sherlock kind of has one foot in each world, doesn't he? He speaks like a gentleman, lives like one, with the housekeeper kind of acting like a servant almost. We have the street Arabs, as he calls them, the little urchins that he has as a sort of little police force of his own, that he's completely familiar with and certainly knows. And then we also have his easy familiarity with Mrs. Smith, the sailor's wife. He's able to kind of flip between classes, and that's a kind of perhaps a reference to this time that Conan Doyle perceived there was greater fluidity than there'd been before between classes. Okay, so what about key themes in this novel? Now this is the first year that I've ever taught this novel, so this is something I've been thinking about a lot, like what are the big headline things that are important? What are the things that I really need to look onto? These are the things that I've come up with. Firstly, the human condition. Now arguably every work of literature deals with the human condition. Certainly all Shakespeare does, but I think this does too. I think Conan Doyle is examining, perhaps the human condition is the wrong term, perhaps it should be the male condition, because he's not really examining what it is to be a woman. Mary Morstan is like a cardboard cutout, but certainly the male characters are much more complex, and we see a sort of examination of like, what does it mean to be a man, and what does it mean to be a good man, and what does it mean to be someone of status. And he kind of examines that, I think, through the characterisation of Sherlock and Watson, because they each have qualities that complement the other, and neither are perfect. Crime is obviously a key theme, not just because Sherlock has these connections with the sort of criminal underclass through those little street urchins, but also, of course, the crime is the driving force in the novel, isn't it? You know, the crime of Bartholomew Sholto's murder is the thing that we really get our teeth into. Initially, we've got mystery, and the crime is a kind of it's a route, isn't it, for Sherlock to show us what he can do. And that's part of a detective novel, isn't it? There's got to be a crime central to the plot. And the fact that it's a murder but has these, and I'm using sort of inverted quotation marks here, exotic qualities like the little blow dart that's found in Bartholomew's neck and stuff. I think Conan Doyle is using this as a way of turning the detective novel into something else, into something that reflects the times, I suppose, as he sees it, and the interests of people who might be reading it. And we'll come back to the exoticism and stuff in the next section. Mystery obviously is a key theme, and there's lots and lots of quotations that will help you to, you know, expand on that, like the fog, frequent references to fog, and that's a motif, isn't it? It recurs all the way through, and it only starts to clear towards the end, because of course it's a reflection, it's a metaphor for the way we, the readers, and Watson cannot see through this impenetrable mystery, but of course Sherlock always can. And there's a bit actually where they're travelling in the coach, I think to the Dale Sholto's house, and Watson observes, as the narrator, that the dim and drizzly weather doesn't have an impact on Sherlock, which again kind of compounds this idea that the weather, the drizzle, the fog is actually about Watson and us, the readers, not about Sherlock himself. So empire and Orientalism, important stuff. So we've mentioned the empire. Orientalism is a base, I'm going to say fetish, obviously I don't mean a sexual fetish, but a sort of fetish that the late Victorians had for collecting items of interest, artistic interest, from the Orient, as they called it in those days. Now the Orient basically just meant the East. So nowadays people tend to think of Oriental referring to Southeast Asia and China. In those days it also meant India, basically anywhere past Turkey was considered the Orient. And people like to collect Chinese vases and Indian carpets and, you know, woven things from Afghanistan, anything they could get basically that reflected, I think, the power of their empire. That was part of it. It was, look, we can go to your countries and take the best of what you've got and bring it home and put it in our living room. And we see that with the Day of Sholto. And it's a kind of, it's the domestic version and the acceptable face almost of the kind of dehumanising racism that we see when Sherlock reads the encyclopedia about Tonga. You know, stealing artworks and stealing culture, if you like, cultural appropriation, we would call it in 2019, is the acceptable face of this much uglier view of those from the East as inferior and less than, even though, of course, we want their art and we want their stuff. Social class is a theme, of course, and I think we see that most keenly through Mary Morstan and Watson, and the fact that Watson believes absolutely, and to his own heartbreak, that if he discovers this treasure, which, because he's a sort of gentleman, if he does, he's going to give it to her, it will put her out of his reach forever, because a rich woman could never marry a man of modest means as he sees himself. And that really is a reflection, again, of the position of women, and that is a theme here. I don't necessarily think Conan Doyle intended it to be, but we, as modern readers, can make a feminist criticism of it and say, right, well, how are women presented? Well, here, they're presented as things that are manipulated, I suppose, in the marriage market by a number of factors, one of which is virginity. We know that from all Victorian fiction, that sort of purity and virginity is the ace card, basically, that Victorian women have. But then there's also money and fortune, because women can't own property in those days. They have to hitch it to whoever they get married to, so they can inherit from their father, but the money is essentially payable to their husband upon their marriage. If they don't get married, you know, they have to defer to their brother or their father for their keep, basically. So the fact that she's going to inherit all this money doesn't mean that she's necessarily going to be rich on her own, but it means that whoever she marries is going to be rich with her, so why would she choose somebody poor, basically, he suggests. Love and marriage and the role of the domestic, that's a major theme, I think, because it's the subplot, isn't it? We're reading a story about some missing jewels and a murder, but we're also really reading a story about Watson getting the girl, aren't we? Like, that's part of what we're invested in, and that's what Conan Doyle wants us to be invested in, because we're supposed to love Watson. He's our narrator, he's the one we're supposed to sympathise with. We're supposed to admire Sherlock, but we're never going to want Sherlock to settle down and get married, because that's not what, you know, drug-addled detectives do. But it's what we want for Watson. And the portrayal of the domestic sphere, by which I mean the home, is very important. We only really get a glimpse of that. Watson gets a glimpse of it through a doorway, and he absolutely waxes lyrical about the impact it has on him seeing Mary Morstan stood in the doorway of her house with Mrs. Forrester standing next to her, like the two women in the doorway with the light shining behind them, is this glorious moment for him, because it symbolises everything he wants. You know, a home, a woman to take care of him, a space in which to exist and be the man that he is. And finally, friendship. Now, if any of you are fans of the BBC adaptation, Sherlock, that like really became a massive thing online, didn't it? People were really invested in the relationship between Sherlock and Watson in that programme, and shipped them, to use the popular terminology. And they did kind of, in the end of that, if you've watched that, kind of get together almost, you know, they ended up raising a baby together. Now clearly in the Victorian version that is not going to happen, but we do have, I think, a real focus on the value of male friendship, which is quite sweet really, because it's perhaps a neglected topic in literature of this period. But Watson doesn't want to criticise Sherlock in the beginning, we know that, and we initially assume that's because he's kind of intimidated by him, but perhaps it's also that he doesn't want to alienate himself from him, because he likes being close to him, he likes living with him, he likes solving crimes with him. And then at the end there's this one kind of sweet moment where Sherlock says that he wants Watson to be the one to give the treasure to Mary Morstan, because basically he knows what that means. He knows that Mary Morstan then will see Watson as the hero rather than Sherlock, and that will play in his favour. So basically it's the Sherlock really does have a heart moment, and that's kind of important, I think. So what are the key kind of points in the play and the quotations that link to them? Now I'm afraid I do not know these quotations off by heart the way I do with Romeo and Juliet. You're going to need to look in your copies of the text and kind of closely read these moments again, but these are the ones that I think you should look at. Firstly, chapter 1 itself, because it establishes Sherlock's character. It's important. The stuff about the drug use, the fact that he's using the drug not because he's addicted but because he wants stimulation, is kind of significant, you know, and he's saying, give me problems, give me work, like my mind stagnates. He needs food for thought, and he uses cocaine in the interim. But it's an interesting kind of look, because we see this imperfect character doing something which wasn't entirely taboo at that time. Like, cocaine was freely available in any kind of apothecary or chemist, and it was in Coca-Cola. But the fact that he's injecting it does lend an air of kind of degeneracy to it, I think. I think in any era, injecting drugs in your own house was sort of frowned upon and looked down upon as kind of taking it rather far. You know, people smoking drugs is one thing, but injecting them is another. Mary Morstan makes an impression. So that lovely little quote at the end when Watson says, "What an attractive woman," when she leaves, is a kind of, it's a slightly comic moment, because it's the juxtaposition of his being so impressed by her and Sherlock just not really even noticing and saying she's just a mere factor or a unit or whatever he calls her. But it's significant because it's a kind of shifting point in the novel, isn't it? It's when the romantic interest is introduced. So structurally, when you're thinking of this play and the way it's been put together, the subplot is dropped in there right from the beginning. Travelling to Thaddeus Sholto's house, mystery, power and Orientalism. So I think that's an important bit. That journey in the coach I alluded to earlier, where Sherlock's not affected by the weather but the rest of them are, is important, because that's the bit where we hear London being described as having like a great beast or something and having tentacles that spread over the city. It's kind of, the city is almost monstrous, which is, I don't know if that reflects Conan Doyle's view or not. It's almost like reminiscent of Blake's view of London. So William Blake's a romantic poet, wrote a poem called London, about basically the city being a den of sin, really, and iniquity, and how capital and money and industrialisation had ruined it. And there's kind of shades of that, I think, in Conan Doyle's depiction. Thank you. The Orientalism, of course, comes in when they get to Thaddeus Sholto's house, and there's the Indian servant, who's described as a Hindu servant. And he's wearing, vibrant colours and kind of reflects the kind of otherness, I suppose. And the other is another one of those terms, like the angel of in the house, which has been coined by 20th century critics when they're talking about Victorian novels. And the other is anybody or anything that is kind of marginalised and separate. So women are frequently turned into the other, especially in kind of Gothic fiction where their sexuality is kind of threatening or whatever. Certainly native, like subjects of the empire, basically native subjects are considered other, like the Hindu servant, for example. The other can also be something monstrous, so like Frankenstein, for example, is the other, and people talk about him being a representation of that. But here we just have the idea that there are British people who are at the centre of this story, who are, good and rational and sensible and so on. And then there is the other, the savage, which is Tonga, who we don't meet until later. Pondicherry Lodge, the mystery there, the depiction of women there, the thing about, like, there's this quote that says something like it was the most pitiful sound one could ever hear, like the frightened cry of a woman or something. And it's that, again, the kind of cardboard cutout womanhood where women are there to be fearful and meek and weak and props, I suppose, for the male action figures. Mary Mawson is the same, she faints constantly. I don't know if you've noticed that when you're reading it. She's always fainting in the cab, and once she gets out of the cab, she feels like she's going to faint. He has to hold her up. It's hammed up a bit. Mary Mawson in the doorway, I've mentioned, find that bit because it's so good. It's the bit when he's going to take her back before he goes to get Toby the dog, and he talks about her standing in the doorway. In fact, I think I've had a... Did I? Oh no, I didn't. Never mind. But do find that bit because it's really significant. And there's a description of... it says something like a tranquil English home, like the effect that it has on him, the tranquil English home. So it's like he's tying the idea of the domestic, which is what he desires, the little wife, the house, to the idea of nationalism and his sort of pride in being British almost, which is interesting. And then he talks about it being a kind of opposite and a something to make him feel better about this wild, savage business. And of course using that term savage, or wild, dark business, I think he said. But wild, again, connects us to the idea of savagery, which connects us to the idea of Tonga. Toby and the dog, comic relief, I've just put, because that's a classic trope in fiction and in drama where you have like a break where the reader can have a laugh, basically. Personally, I wasn't laughing at Toby the dog, but you know, that's the point of it, isn't it?
I found
thanks.
Sorry,
Oh, that's it, yeah. Brilliant, thank you. So the bit in the doorway, it's on page 54 if you want to make a note if you've got one of these copies you can look at later. And it's just this: as we drove away, I stole a glance back, and I still seemed to see that little group on the step, the two graceful, clinging figures, the half-opened door, the hall light shining through stained glass, the barometer and the bright stair rods. It was soothing to catch even that passing glimpse of a tranquil English home in the midst of the wild, dark business which had absorbed us. So he puts the domestic sphere, the women, on the opposite side to the wild and the dark, which is kind of significant, I think, thematically. Sherlock and Mrs. Smith, class and family, you know, you can go back and look at that bit, but the way he speaks to her is indicative of his ability to kind of transcend class and talk to anybody. And then the bit that I think is really significant, I just want to finish on, is the encyclopedia when he looks up, is it the Andaman Islands, where Tonga has come from, and he says he describes him as, Watson, when Sherlock starts reading from the encyclopedia about the natives of the Andaman Islands, says, oh, a savage. And that term, savage, has long been used for hundreds of years previous even to this book being written to describe native people of foreign lands when Europeans have, you know, in inverted commas, discovered them. And Tonga's animalistic kind of bestial qualities, you know, his chattering teeth and the way that he sounds and the way that he looks is all a reflection, I think, of a very I'm going to call it Eurocentric view of the world, in which Europe is the only civilized island in the midst of a wild, dark, savage world populated by subhuman natives who are barely more than animals. And that's, I think, probably with Conan Doyle's view. And it's almost like when I talk about other things and say, oh, we call this proto-feminist because nobody had that word then. Certainly it's racist, it's grotesquely racist, but nobody at that time would have called it that, because the concept of racism, as we understand it, didn't exist. It was considered common sense that white was supreme and best, and that the natives, whoever they were inferior and subhuman. So we can say Conan Doyle was a racist, and he certainly was, but he certainly wouldn't have ever thought of himself that way, or considered that to be a bad thing, even. So that, in terms of linking back to context, I think is important, that there is always that view of the world that he has as he shows us these characters.